So Israel was never able to make peace with the Palestinians. And the most important duty of a government is to make peace, to give security to its people. Giving them a lot of military, giving your people a lot of military is not security. It's the opposite of security. You give military because you're aware that you have no peace, that you have plenty of enemies. So you try to assure your people by giving them a strong military. But the reality is that the only security that you could give to your people is peace. And Israel was never able to give peace for 72 years, even before that, to their people, was never able to make peace with the Palestinians, and therefore it remains in constant wars with many countries, shifting all the time, but many enemies. So Israel is, and one of the reasons that Israel was not able to give peace is because it is not a democracy. And I discussed that earlier in one of my posts, but it doesn't have a constitution. It doesn't have a separation between government and religion. It doesn't give its entire population, and by saying entire population, I include the Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, because Israel controls them for 50 some years. Any democracy would require the government to give the people that are under its control for 50 some years the right to be citizens and the right to vote. But Israel claims that it is privileged, and it is allowed to discriminate against Palestinians because they are not Jewish. Well, that's the opposite of a democracy. In a democracy, your religion doesn't matter. That's the whole purpose of a democracy, is to make sure that you have a government that represents the people regardless of your religion, nationality, or any other identifying features. A democracy is for everyone. You cannot say, well, we are democracy only for Jews, or only for tall people or short people. Just not. That's the opposite of what democracy stands for. The purpose of democracy is to do away with all these special privileges and to say, okay, we are all people, we are all entitled to be treated equally, and we are all entitled to be represented in a fair way. When you say, well, you guys in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, you're not really our people, then you are not a democracy. So Israel is not a democracy, and there are other reasons why Israel doesn't have a constitution, it doesn't have, and I'll be speaking about that, about all the features that requires to be part of a democracy. And I discussed that in one of my videos, or several videos, and I'll discuss it again. So Israel is really a danger to its own people, to the Jewish people. It's also a danger to the Palestinian people. And it is a danger to the whole region because it is not able to extricate itself from the concept of Jewish superiority. And it's not able to extricate itself from the conflict. That's why Israel is not democracy, and it is a dangerous. It's a danger to the whole region because it accumulates huge amount of military, of weapons, including nuclear weapons, including nuclear submarines. And it doesn't have a way to resolve the conflict. In fact, it perpetuates the conflict. It has no formula to resolve the conflict. So this is why I suggest the creation of a common government for the people of Israel and Palestine together. A government that would be created by the whole area. When I say the whole area, I mean the area of Israel, the Gaza, Jerusalem, and the West Bank. And I did not mention those areas in order of importance. They are all important. A common government is the only way to make peace. Now, you may say peace is not good. I don't like peace. But if you are interested in peace, and by the way, I think if you are not interested in peace, you don't have a legitimate argument to argue for your position. Because if you do not have an end game, if you don't say, well, my end game is peace, then whatever goal you have, in my mind, it's not legitimate. The ultimate goal has to be peace. And Israel does not have a formula for peace, and a common government is the only formula for peace because it includes everyone. The people in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. So today I would like to talk about the legislative branch. The legislative branch that I believe should be established in the common government. In the common government, we'll have three branches. Legislative, which is the parliament that makes the laws. The executive, which is the president and the vice president. And the judicial. And by the way, this is one of the reasons that Israel is not a democracy, is because it doesn't have these true branches of government. So, but I would like to speak about the legislative branch. The legislative branch will have to be parliament members from the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, and Israel. The way I formulated it, it will be 300 parliament members in the whole area. Each parliament member will represent 47,000 people. And by the way, we are going to simulating this on February 24th. Please send me or sign up. Here is www.ipconfederation.org. Sign up on ipconfederation.org, please. And you will be participating in the simulation. It's not going to be a lecture. You will be asked to participate either as Israeli parliament member, Palestinian parliament member, as Hamas leader, the president of the Palestinian authorities, and the Prime Minister of Israel. We just want to simulate, to show how this whole thing can work and how it could make peace. So sign up at www.ipconfederation.org. So the 300 parliament members will be elected by the people of Israel and Palestine. 14 million people in Israel and Palestine. And they will elect 300 parliament members. And the 300 parliament members each represent a district that is 47,000 people. Each district will have 47,000 people. So the parliament members, whether they are Israelis or Palestinians, will not represent the whole nation of Palestine or the whole nation of Israel. They represent their own district. Now that district could be either Israeli, could be Palestinian, it could be a mixed district. But at the end of the day, and by the way, in a mixed district, a Israeli could vote for a Palestinian, and Palestinian could vote for Israeli. And when I'm talking about a common government and a common parliament, I'm not talking about dismantling the Israeli government or the Palestinian government. They will remain the governments of the Israeli people. The Israeli government will be the government of the Israeli people. The Palestinian government will be the government of the Palestinian people. But the common government will represent the entire people of Israel and Palestine in the whole area, the 14 million people. And the parliament member in the common government will pass legislation, and in order for them to pass legislation, you would require 55% of the Palestinian parliament members and 55% of the Israeli parliament members to vote yes on the same legislation. So right away you know that the legislation would be reasonable because you need both the Israeli and the Palestinian. They would not be able to pass unreasonable legislation. They would not be able to pass legislation that takes advantage of one side over another. Now, once they pass the legislation, then there is another safety feature to make sure that the legislation is reasonable. What's the next safety feature? Is that you go to the Israeli government, the Palestinian governments, you go to the Israeli Knesset, the parliament, and the Palestinian parliament, and you offer them a veto power. You say, here, we are the people of Israel and Palestine, we pass legislation, we are the parliament for the whole area, we pass legislation, but we recognize your sovereignty, we recognize your power, and we are offering you a veto power over the legislation we passed. So that's another safety measures to make sure that the legislation will pass. So the structure of this common government would preclude the possibility of one side taking advantage over the other. Now, you may say, well, Joseph, both the Israeli and the Palestinian governments will veto everything. And I want you to think about it twice, because if the legislation is reasonable, and that's what we are practicing in the simulation. Please join the next simulation. It's on February 24th. I beg you to join. Sign up at www.ipconfederation.org. And you will see how reasonable legislation forces the Israeli and the Palestinian governments to accept the legislation, because the legislation is passed by their own people and the legislation is reasonable and it brings peace and prosperity. So if the Palestinian or the Israeli government decide to veto those legislations, they would lose legitimacy internally within their own people and internationally. Because they both claim, the Israeli and the Palestinian governments both claim that they want peace, that they would search under every rock to find peace. And here is peace in front of them. So they would not be able to veto reasonable legislation. So this system provides for a mechanism to create reasonable legislation that will bring peace and prosperity to the people of Israel and Palestine. And in my opinion, peace and prosperity is the tip of the iceberg. They would be able to change the whole area because they changed the narrative. A common government has a bird eye view on the whole area. It has the ability to think about what's good for everyone, not what's good for 9 million Israelis only and ignore the 5 million Palestinians, or not what's good for the 5 million Palestinians and ignore the 9 million. It's a government for everyone, and they live together. So it makes perfect sense for them to have a common government. So join the next simulation. It's going to take place on February 24th. Sign up at ipconfederation.org. We're going to ask you to act as Israeli parliament member or Palestinian parliament member. And the main thing is that everyone is equal. Everyone has equal voice. No one side takes advantage of the other. We need people to participate as the regional leaders, Hamas leader, Palestinian Authority leaders, Israeli Prime Minister. We also need people to act as President of the United States, Prime Minister of Great Britain, France, Germany, China, the World Bank, to show how this whole thing will work together to make peace. And peace is the only ultimate goal. Peace is the only thing that gives security. It's not about having military power. And by the way, we do not take away, if you feel that military power is what you rely on, what's important to you, this formula does not take it away. We say the Israelis will continue to have their military, the Palestinians will continue to have their military, and they can also, based on the Constitution, and you can read the Constitution at ipconfederation.org, based on the Constitution, the Israeli government and the Palestinian government would continue, if they choose to negotiate, and we could agree to any solution between them. And the common government based on the Constitution does not preclude any agreement, does not wish to undermine any agreement between those two governments. So I urge you to sign up at ipconfederation.org. The simulation will take place on Wednesday, February 24th at 7 in the evening Jerusalem time, 5 in the evening London time, 12 noon New York time, and 9 in the morning Los Angeles time. So wherever you are around the world, it will be on Zoom. When you sign up, you will get a invitation, and you'll get a password to join the simulation. And I would love to see your comments. I would love to see you participate and to see your comments and hear what you think about it. I love skeptics. If you're a skeptic, that's terrific. because skeptics ask a lot of questions and they ask good questions. And I hope to see the skeptics in you, and I hope to see all of you, including those that are interested in seeing how this thing works. So have a good day, and we'll see you again. Thank you, and bye-bye.